Hi everybody, thank you so much for having me. I imagine you can hear me all okay. Excellent. As you've heard, my name's Charlotte Wood and I'm a writer mainly of fiction. And last year I had the good fortune of being the first writer in residence here at the Charles Perkins Centre, which was a really thrilling opportunity, I have to say. So as part of that fellowship, that I was invited to dip into the library's rare books collection and present one of these talks today. Excuse my voice, I'm afraid it's a little husky today. So as you've heard, among my interests is the creative process. And I'm really fascinated by the way different artists talk about the hows and whys of art making and the genesis and processes of art making. So when I learned that Rare Books had in its possession a limited edition book by Norman Lindsay called Creative Effort, an essay in affirmation, my interest was piqued and I decided to investigate it for this talk. So Norman Lindsay, as I'm sure you all know, was an Australian painter, writer, cartoonist, illustrator, and sculptor, among other things. He was born in 1879 in Victoria, and he died in Sydney at the age of 90, having lived for many years at Falconbridge in the Blue Mountains, where his house and garden are still open to visitors today as a gallery. Lindsay was enormously prolific as an artist and a writer. He produced countless paintings and etchings and illustrations in oil and watercolour, zillions of sculptures, and he published 11 novels and 2 children's books and a number of essays and plays and books of illustrations. It's actually quite hard to keep up with the incredible productivity of this man. So before I began this, looking at this essay, I knew, and in fact I still really only know sort of basics about Norman Lindsay's life. But he was always very close to my heart because he wrote and illustrated one of my favourite books from childhood. And of course I'm talking about The Magic Pudding. My faded copy here, although I realised this week that this isn't actually my childhood copy, which was terribly ripped and falling apart. But it's still a very well-loved book in my house nonetheless. And I have really vivid memories of childhood, of lying in bed as night after night my father read The Magic Pudding to me. Now, despite my sisters and my usual avoidance of books and TV shows that had, as we described it, no girls in, because even as very small children we intuited that there was something wrong with the world that assumed we didn't exist. I still loved The Magic Pudding. I loved pugilistic Bill Barnacle and his friend Sam Sornoff, the penguin bold. I loved the gentlemanly Bunyip Bluegum. But most of all, of course, I loved the pudding itself. Albert, the cut and come again pudding, and I can't actually find a whole page illustration, which I'm stunned about. You will know Albert. Albert was rude, angry, gloomy, resentful, disobedient, violent and self-pitying, and also very powerful. And all of those things, as a small girl, I absolutely longed to be, but it was forbidden. So I'm sure that's part of the appeal for children of The Magic Pudding. The story of these 3 happy wanderers and their pudding, their adventure was always under threat from the notorious wombat and possum puddin' thieves. The story was rollicking and rambunctious, and Lindsay's black and white illustrations all the way through, as I'm sure you know, were full of the same sort of wild energy as the story, and I absolutely loved it. So you can see why I felt so warmly towards Norman Lindsay. And I looked forward to reading this work, Creative Effort, an essay in affirmation. It was a limited edition, almost 300-page essay published for the author, quote, by Art in Australia in 1920. So I wondered as I approached this book, how much common ground would Lindsay and I find in our thoughts about the creative process, with almost a century now having passed between us? Would I be as enthralled by his prose in this essay as I was by The Magic Pudding? Well, I have to say that after reading this essay, my warm feelings towards Norman Lindsay have pretty much vanished altogether. And it's not Norman Lindsay's fault, I know that. I knew that Lindsay was a self-proclaimed provocateur, always should ring alarm bells, and I knew of his cartoons portraying the yellow peril and the red menace for the Bulletin magazine as propaganda. Excuse me. I knew he was a virulent anti-Semite. And I probably didn't know, but would have assumed that, like many in his time, Lindsay also believed that the female mind, as he called it, was only half formed, and certainly a woman could never be a great artist. Gay people, he believed, were also incomplete individuals. But even taking into account the mores of the time, which were homophobic and racist and sexist, I understand that Lindsay's views were still at the extreme end of that and very repugnant, and so repugnant that even Quadrant magazine in 2011 lambasted him as offensive, and let's face it, that takes some doing. But all of this in itself still didn't actually put me off reading his essay. I was prepared for these prejudices. I would just set them aside. But it is really difficult to overstate the abhorrence that actually rises in you as you force yourself through sentences that casually refer to the Jew or the Frenchman as though they were different species of vermin, or to women as utilitarian objects only useful or appealing when naked, preferably with their pure, full white breasts suckling something, presumably a great male artist in the making. As I say, I still was prepared to set these things aside. But even if I could set them aside as historical, as evidence of a place and a time in history, and I did try, what was more difficult was making my way through the style of thinking that lends itself really naturally to such outright bigotry. Because even when purely focused on the artistic process, to the modern ear, my modern ear especially, I found Lindsay's prose to be ponderous and pompous at once, with none of the verve and the life of his children's books. The rhetoric is full of hierarchies and adversaries, dividing all of humanity, most especially artists, into winners and losers, great intellects or lesser ones. And at times his sentences ended up going in so many circles, I was often at a complete loss to actually understand what he meant. But more depressingly and more meaningfully, I guess, I detected no real sense of inquiry, that sense of inquiry that to me signals the mind of a true artist at work trying to understand something. Lindsay, in this essay, I think would be happy to admit that he's not asking questions, he's giving answers. So many answers. His pronouncements are peppered with artistic cage fights initiated by him. Dickens versus Shakespeare, Velázquez versus Rembrandt, Rubens versus Michelangelo. You get the picture. And in these contests, there is always a winner and a kind of pathetic loser, decided by Norman. So the winners and the higher minds, for what it's worth, include Nietzsche, Shakespeare, Rubens, and Rembrandt. But the exhaustive list of losers, those with lower minds, include Zola, Dickens, all of Japanese art, Christians, Bolsheviks, women who repudiate childbirth, suicides, the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, actors, journalists, Jesus, he was a Jew, Velázquez, Flaubert, Milton, Dante, and on and on and on. And I did find this very difficult to wade through, almost 300 pages of this with this swaggering tone and the endless repetition, the declarations and the unassailable rightness of the self-published white man. So for me, reading this essay has been like trying to scoop up molasses with a sieve. The substance of a paragraph's meaning would hold together for just a moment before sort of oozing away completely. And no matter how many times I tried, I found it impossible to gather these ideas into coherence. So my comprehension was left in a kind of sticky and formless mess, my sieve empty of anything with which to nourish new thoughts or perceptions about the creative process. So imagine my relief when I came to a section quite a long way into the essay called Creation, Revelation, Exposure, where I could finally take hold of some of Lindsay's discussion and actually really use it to think with about my own work. Whether this is because by page 170, I, a mere woman after all, had finally understood his superior mode of analysis, or whether from sheer exhaustion or desperation, I really don't know. But whatever the reason, I fell upon this section with gratitude, finding at last some interesting provocations and questions about the nature of art with which I've often wrestled myself. And it's these I'm going to share with you now. So I'm going to preface this with a warning that my interpretation of this is completely idiosyncratic and quite possibly very antithetical to Lindsay's intentions. But I have to say that if I've learned one thing from Norman Lindsay, it's the almost erotic appeal of the staggering generalisation. The appeal to the author, at least. So the first idea that I want to point to in this section is Lindsay's idea that one of the defining characteristics of the truly artistic impulse is that it must create, not replicate. Now that might sound simple, but it's actually not, because it goes to the question of the genesis of art and where the raw materials of art come from. Lindsay suggests that art must come from the inner world of the artist, not the outer material world of ordinary people and things. It also then evokes a question that has really long occupied me, and that is, how much should an artist be in the world and how much separate from it? And that then begets another question, is what is art for? But Lindsay puts the tension between inner and outer worlds in this way. Quote, "Things seen and heard, out of these we must create. To the artist it throws a mass of colour and form, crude or beautiful as it is affected by light and atmosphere, or as its shapes fall into harmony of line or mass, tone or colour. To the musician, it offers perception of beauty or emotion by the analysis of sound and rhythm. To the poet, it offers the perception of beauty or emotion by the analysis of words. To the thinker, it offers the complexities of mind itself, the problem of man and nature, of spirit and brute, in short, the conscious analysis of thought. But first of all, it offers only the material for these expressions of vision. This material is not in itself creative. It is a thing already created. Therefore, to let expression rest at a statement of something that already exists is but to make a replica of what exists. He cannot be said to create who does no more than copy a thing which is already made. I do think that represents a really interesting challenge to the artist, and perhaps especially to the fiction writer. Because I think, what is my job if not to reflect society to itself? But there is a point at which an artist's careful observation may simply become mimicry. And where is that line, I guess, is a question that I think is interesting about that. And what comes to mind for me is my own sort of boredom, I suppose, at looking at a photorealistic painting. If the achievement is purely the accuracy of replication, then why not simply take a photograph? Where does the transformation into art take place? And I think that is a very good question for those of us who write from life. What is the tipping point, and how do you transform observation into art? The second idea that I found interesting in this section is the distinction that Lindsay makes between what he calls objective art and creative art, or what I might call art, entertainment and art, the distinction between entertainment and art. And Lindsay writes this: "We must throw aside the thing which we first seek to protect, our own sense of entertainment. We must throw away a piece of our heart. It is a difficult sacrifice, for not only our sentiment is involved, but our egotism too. What, we cry, this picture recalls to me a sense of something I have seen, something that charmed my eyes. This story brings back to me an episode of my youth. Here is an expression of life that I could almost believe to be my own. Here is a writer that makes me laugh and weep. Here, while I lingered over this book, this picture, I've forgotten myself. I have been happy, content, entertained. But he goes on to ask, is this the mission of intellect? Is not this sensation of pleasure and contentment rather a narcotic? Does not the sensation of this recreated piece of life merely reassure your sense of also being alive? And I side with Lindsay when he declares that reassurance is not the point of art, that rather its purpose is to reveal us to ourselves. And this revelation, Lindsay says, is necessarily disturbing and it is difficult. We must ask other questions, he says, quote, is it not the mission of intellect that you should realise yourself? And does not the revelation of your own mind rather startle and perturb you? Does not a light thrown suddenly on the problem of man's destiny, your destiny, give you an uneasy feeling? This then, I think, is the choice that he's talking about, the choice that we have to make. Cheerfulness and entertainment on the one hand, or the hard but truly nourishing work of self-reflection on the other. Lindsay goes on, it may hardly make us happy to be dragged face to face with ourselves, to be forced to realise where we have failed, where we have been stupid, where we have given up effort. But we cannot be said to be intellectually alive unless we are so made aware of ourselves. Again, here I do discover common ground with Norman. And it echoes a quote I've always loved from the painter Georges Braque, who maintained that the purpose of art is to disturb. And I don't mean that a painting should never be decorative or that books should only dwell in the miserable or the obscure. But I do feel gratitude to Lindsay here for articulating to me why I feel a kind of draining sense of despair when I read sentiments like this one I saw in a Facebook book club post recently. Looking for some reading recommendations to take on a relaxing getaway. Nothing sad though, or dark, or heartbreaking. Something uplifting, please. Entertaining and funny would be great. Relaxation, reassurance, entertainment, lightness, all leading down an ever-narrowing path to that ghastly new watchword, relatability. For an artist who seeks to understand herself and the often difficult and unpleasant complexity of their world, demands like this leave us stranded. I've had readers decry my books because a character doesn't wear enough deodorant or isn't respectful to his mother. So for every reader who seeks to understand herself through reading fiction, it seems there is another who is offended by a novel that does not provide the comfort of confirming what she already believes. There's a third interesting question that Lindsay provokes here in this part of the essay, and it's about, about how much an artist should reveal of himself or herself, how much of they should be visible in their own work. And his assertion quite often is that creative passion, those words, creative passion, is essential. And by this he appears to mean that for a work of art to succeed, for the artist to reveal the emotional life of the reader or the listener, his own human vulnerability must be unashamedly visible in the work. Art as a purely intellectual exercise is anathema to Lindsay. According to him, Flaubert's Madame Bovary is a failure because, quote, Flaubert not only disavows any sentiment for humanity, he is terribly concerned for fear we should discover his own. This he hides from us like something obscene. Now, setting aside the fact that Madame Bovary is considered a masterpiece by many a fine mind, I am interested in the idea that to make good art, one must make oneself vulnerable, not just intellectually but emotionally, and that vulnerability should be detectable in the work. I feel kind of torn on this, but I have to say that my instincts tend to accord with his. That to make oneself visible in the creation of art is to make oneself vulnerable, and vulnerability is a form of risk. I often exhort beginner writers that they need to stop hiding, because hiding is self-protection, and there's nothing like self-protection to drain the life out of a novel. And in beginner writers, this sort of hiddenness might manifest in the form of impossibly well-behaved characters, certainly none who don't wear enough deodorant, or unquestionably correct views on refugees or women's rights. Or it even might manifest stylistically in prose that is so highly polished that it's impossible to find fault with. But I think that allowing your work to have cracks that show, allowing ugliness or mess or uncertainty in a work, knowing that this may lead your work to be derided, it may lead even to you personally being derided, that allowing those things creates risk, and risk creates energy, and energy is essential to creative life. A work of art without energy is without life, and who really wants a well-made corpse as a work of art? The last provocation of Norman Lindsays that I want to talk about here is his challenge to the pernicious and in Australia a very pervasive idea that art should be useful. I was once asked by a nice lady at an event like this whether I had ever considered abandoning writing fiction and doing something useful with my life to help people, as she herself had. I blundered my way through a kind of lofty answer that defended the usefulness of art and its capacity to help people. But I now wish that I'd answered more boldly. This is what Norman Lindsay says about utilitarianism and art. He says, the materialistic mind, the lower mind, reasons from a basis of utility. And to be useful on earth, one need not even be aware of the problem of consciousness at all. Consciousness is an element so remote, so isolated from the affairs of life, that only under the sudden stress of pain or fear is humanity even made dimly aware of it. But there need be no concern here, he continues. Perceptivity of consciousness alone begins its moral responsibility. Where it is not perceived, its effort is not demanded. Its very remoteness from the common business of existing is its essence, for it is the final test on earth of human value. And if it was common property, it could have no value. Its paradox is that its highest perception brings the highest conviction of failure. He goes on, where consciousness of the moral problem of development is supreme, it must live by the conviction of its imperfection on earth. For the symbol of perfection it strives for is already beyond earth, and it lives by striving, not by attaining. So what I take Lindsay to mean here is that if art were to be widely accessible and or useful, that very accessibility would render it valueless. It only has value, the highest value, if it is difficult or even impossible to fully perceive. This is a highly dangerous statement to make in contemporary Australia, where artists are widely perceived as parasites and derided for their uselessness and their supposed elitism. In a climate where, in an effort to gain community support, arts administrators increasingly desperately, it seems to me, point to scientific studies showing that consuming art can decrease levels of cortisol, or that producing art improves psychological resilience, or administrators assiduously researching the economic contribution to society of art galleries or the publishing industry. To those people, the idea that inaccessibility in itself is a virtue really borders on treason. But it is an idea worth thinking about. Why must everything be easy and accessible and pre-digested? Why, indeed, must everything be useful? Returning to the questionnaire at my book reading, sometime after that I asked my fellow writer Christos Tsiolkas about this. Now, as you will probably know, Christos is an artist deeply concerned with questions of ethics, but also one whose every utterance decries censorship and wowserism. And I asked him what he would have said. And he said that he too thought usefulness was a particularly Australian obsession. He said, your feelings about that question are going to depend on what you believe about pleasure and whether pleasure is something good, he told me. He said, I'm caught between two answers. I know that art is useful in that very political, ethical way. I don't think I'd have survived the self-loathing or self-hatred or confusion of my younger years if it hadn't been for certain works that answered something for me, that expressed a voice that made me feel there was a future for me. But I do think we are deeply suspicious of pleasure in this society, really, really suspicious of it. And I do think there's a value in what we do, even if it's just to give pleasure. And I think Norman Lindsay would be very happy with that answer. I find myself also caught between answers to this question of usefulness. And I don't think I can go to Lindsay's extreme of a dose relationship between remoteness and inherent value. But I like that he said it. And I certainly abhor the notion of a causal relationship in the other direction, that the more popular a work of art is, then the more useful it is and the more inherent value it has. I think that one of the artist's jobs is to defend art from the utilitarian, market-driven ethos of our times. I think one of our jobs is to promote art for art's sake and to protect it from the idea that everything has an economically measurable value and that if it doesn't, it must be destroyed or abandoned. For as soon as you begin putting utilitarian constraints on art, it begins to wither on the vine. Poetry makes nothing happen, wrote W.B. Yeats. It survives. Now, there are other deep and fascinating questions arising from this essay of Norman Lindsay's, and particularly from the section I'm talking about. And they include, must the making of art cost the artist? Should an artist suffer? Is an artist born or made? Is nature capable of producing anything to match the beauty of art? So there is a lot to think about in this essay. And I find myself getting to the end of it surprised. Because despite the hierarchies and the adversarial nature and the belligerent tirades of earlier in the piece, despite that wildly outdated bigotry, it turns out that Norman Lindsay and I can speak to one another across time after all. And against the odds, Lindsay's creative effort in the end has provoked for me some really important thinking about my own work. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm going to open the floor to questions. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone.
I wanted to return to your theme of visibility and vulnerability in the context of your own work and perhaps the one that I'm most familiar with, The Natural Way of Things, and whether in calling out misogyny you experienced a lot of stigmatism or accusations of misandry. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Thank you for that question. So I'm not sure if other people would know about, my last novel is called The Natural Way of Things, and it is a kind of critique of misogyny, really. Surprisingly, I was terrified actually when I went out into the world to talk about this book, which it's a very full-on book. It's very dark, it's very bleak. I hope ultimately not bleak in the end, but a lot of people find it so, I think. And having seen the way that other women who call out misogyny have been treated, I was absolutely petrified. Luckily for me, the really horrible trolls don't seem to be able to read literary fiction, so I didn't, or have no interest in it, unsurprisingly. So I really didn't get any of that stuff that I expected. I mean, I got, when I won the Stella Prize, which is a prize for women, I didn't read the comments on the newspaper articles. I caught sight of one or two, which were the usual pretty vile stuff, but I wasn't attacked personally for approaching this material. I bizarrely had a lot of incredibly positive feedback from men, which I did not expect. I expected, I hoped to get some positive feedback from women, but compared to my other books, one of which had a central character who was a very nice man, other books of mine have had really nice male characters in them, intelligent, sensitive people. This was the book that seems to have, that certainly has men writing to me in a way they never have about my other work, and saying that they found the book powerful, that they thought it was important, that they wanted their sons to read it, that they learned things that they thought they already knew about this stuff, but it hit them in a particular way. So that was incredibly gratifying. And the question about vulnerability in art is a really difficult one, because only you know when you're creating it that you're vulnerable. But I do think there's an energy that is detectable by the reader or the viewer of a painting. And I'm not sure about the question of whether art must cost the artist. I'm always really torn on that. I feel that, you know, some days I think, yes, it absolutely should, and other days I think that's a romantic nonsense. So, you know, I haven't figured it all out by any means, but thanks for the question.
I was wondering, how have you come to understand your own creative process, and how has it evolved, and what type of conditions do you sort of try to create and maintain to really sort of bring that creativity to the fore?
Thank you. The one thing I've really understood is that it changes all the time, and that things that worked for the last book are not necessarily going to work for the new book, which is really annoying. Because when you write one book, you think, oh, whew, I figured out how to do it. Here I go again. And then you sit down and, you know, most writers, I think, would say this, that every book is a new creature, that the old rules don't apply, especially if you're trying to do something different each time. And I guess for me, the main conditions of allowing creativity to flourish are routine and discipline. Making sure that, you know, I have a set sort of while I am writing. I've had the last 3 months off writing because I've been in Europe promoting the last book, but you know, there's that. I can't remember who said this, but somebody said visions come to prepared spirits, and so that you get into a rhythm, into a sort of momentum of practice, and you don't expect it to work every day. I mean, most of the time that I'm at the desk feels like utter failure, and most of it is utter failure, but then I have to go through the failure to get the, you know, the non-failure. So I think there's a lot of romance about the creative process, and that, you know, about the muse and all of that sort of stuff. But to me, it really comes down to tenacity and discipline, but also a willingness to be vulnerable to surprises in the work, and to let the work sort of show you how to write it. So with The Natural Way of Things, for a long time I was very frightened by how dark it was seeming to be, and I kept trying to make it much nicer than that, and you know, because it revealed things about me that I didn't like. It revealed that I was angry, that I was that I could imagine these really horrible things, and that was frightening to me. So only when I accepted that this book is showing me how to write it if I let it happen. So there's this sort of tension between, sometimes I call it between the grit and the gift, you know, between the grit to just push on and force your way through stuff that's not working, while at the same time relaxing enough to get out of your own way and allow the work to come to you. So it's this weird tension that I think is, you know, it makes it difficult. But the other thing that I really do understand, I've produced a book of interviews with other writers about their process, is that everybody is completely different. And the only way to do it is the way that works for you. So, you know, we all madly go and read, oh, so-and-so gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning and writes for 3 hours and then goes for a 10-mile run and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, you know, then Amanda Laurie says, well, I can't work till 11 o'clock. I go, yay. But it's learning to accept and trust your own process that is that will eventually help you out, I think.